In a small town in eastern France, a bridge crosses a narrow river, joining two communities. Fismes and Fismes are footnotes in the story of the Great War, but for American doughboys in August 1918, this is where they first encountered the sharp end of the war on the Western Front. On an overcast day in May 1940, a group of khaki-clad French engineers peered from behind the sandbags in a side street of Fismes, a small town on the Aisne, and which overlooked a bridge across the river Vela. These men had been fighting hard for days as the German blitzkrieg cast its dark shadows across the French Ardennes. This attack had mirrored the Schlieffen plan of a generation before, but this time the Germans had seemed unstoppable. Yet now, here, at this point, this bridge, there would be some account. Here they would be halted. Infantry and wheeled reconnaissance units were nearing the bridge. The rumble of their engines grew near. The turrets turned, looking for targets. It was now or never. An order was given, and the charges which these French sappers had placed under the stonework of the bridge erupted, sending rubble and debris into the air. As the dust dispersed, it was clear that the bridge span had been dropped into the Vela River. There would be no crossing here, at least not for now. And there at Fismes, perhaps the French soldiers hadn't noticed it, but amongst the chaos of battle and the thud, thud, thud of the 20mm cannons from the armoured cars, maybe, just maybe, they could see two figures still standing close to the bridge. Not fellow soldiers, but stone-carved women, mounted on narrow columns. These were the symbols of liberty, of hope, perhaps, of a better world yet to come, and beneath them they could just make out the carved faces of soldiers too. But not French soldiers. These were Americans in broad-brimmed helmets. Men from another war, another battle, another day when the bridge at Fismes had once more been vital to those who battled for its possession. For on that day, 22 years before, Fismes and its neighbour across the Vela, Fismes, had resounded to the dull crump of shell fire and the piercing scream of flamethrowers. Another war ago, and along with it, so many distant lives. When you follow the pathways of the Great War as you travel across that landscape of the Western Front, it can surprise you in so many ways. You discover places that you've never seen before, and occasionally it reminds you of others that for some reason you'd somehow forgotten. On a March day earlier this year, while on a battlefield recce on the Aisne with fellow Ledger battlefield guides, some roadworks took us almost randomly into the town of Fismes, or Fismes to the troops who were there in the Great War. It was years since I'd last visited this town, and a place I hadn't thought of for quite a while. But then I realised where we were, and a flash of memory took us down some side streets to a road bridge over the Vela River, the bridge that separates Fismes from its smaller neighbour, Fismes. And there it was, the American bridge, with the figures rising from the column and the faces of doughboys carved deep into the stonework. Rebuilt after the Second World War, the bridge showed signs of the 1940 damage when another conflict had brought war to the banks of the Vela once more. And now I discovered that, far from forgotten, the bridge and the story of the Americans who had fought there in 1918 was now properly remembered, with modern information panels and a memorial park by the river, almost certainly an outcome of a project during the Great War centenary. And while reading those panels, a name bounced out of the text and hit me hard. Hervey Allen, one perhaps unknown to most of those listening to this podcast. But Allen was a writer born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1889, who had served as an officer in the 111th Infantry and 28th Keystone Division during that Great War, a division often called the Iron Division, and was wounded here at Fismes in August 1918. Later he became a professor of English at Pittsburgh University and wrote several best-selling books, dying at the young age of 60 in 1949. But his work inspiring young American minds, while important, isn't what he should be remembered for, in my view. Hervey Allen wrote not only the best American Expeditionary Force memoir of the Great War, but perhaps one of the best of the entire conflict. And that book, which I'm holding in my hand now, is called Toward the Flame. First published in 1926, it's been in and out of print ever since, and it's available online to read for free as an ebook or as a PDF, and I'll post a link to that onto the podcast website. Original copies are not difficult to find. First editions, of course, will be expensive, and it's nice to have a physical copy of this book because the memoir is illustrated with some very simple but highly effective sketches. And the book starts with Allen, a company commander in the 111th Infantry, taking part in the Aisne-Marne battles of May to August of 1918, one of the most critical moments in the war of that period, when Paris was once more threatened by German advance, as it had been 4 years before with the Battle of the Marne, and a vast international army led by the French stopped this phase of the German advance in that area east of Paris. But who were the 111th Infantry and the 28th Division, and what had brought them to Fismes? The 28th were a American National Guard unit, and the National Guard in America is very similar to the Territorial Force or the Territorial Army in Britain. These are part-time soldiers. So these were men who had served in the US Army before the war as volunteers in the National Guard, would have done what we describe as drill hall sessions and annual camps and things like that, and then they were activated into units when America joined the war in 1917, grouped by regiments into divisions, which mostly were fellow National Guard units. Some of the men who joined up when the war began were also put into these units, so not every man necessarily was a pre-war National Guard member, but I would guess that in units like this, quite a high proportion of them probably were. And this particular unit, like Hervey Allen, were men who were National Guard troops from Pennsylvania. So it had a kind of local aspect to it, perhaps not in the same way as a British POWs battalion, but nevertheless not dissimilar. The division itself, the 28th Division, formed at Camp Hancock in Georgia in April 1917, and over the next few months of its history was plagued with uniform, kit and weapon issues, just like the new army, the British new army, had those same problems at the beginning of the Great War. So the expansion of the US Army, even involving National Guard units, meant that when men were brought together in great numbers to form these new American divisions as part of the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, there was a shortage of equipment. To suddenly equip an army of this size was a challenge, as the British had found, as the Canadians had found, as the New Zealanders and the Australians had found. America was now going through the same kind of experience. So it takes time for these new American units to really come together and be any kind of meaningful fighting force that could then be sent overseas. And as a regiment, the 111th Infantry were one part of the 28th Division, and they were the rough equivalent of a British brigade in size. So a British brigade, around about 3,500 men, and an American infantry regiment made up of a number of battalions were similar in scope and size to that British brigade. It's a slight difference in the way the American army operated as opposed to the British. And Hervey Allen commanded Baker Company of the 1st Battalion of the 111th Regiment. And once that 111th Regiment and the wider 28th Division was deemed to be combat ready, it was then sent overseas with the rest of the American Expeditionary Force to join the Allied forces on the Western Front. And very soon it found itself in the vanguard of the fight. And Allen and his men found themselves fighting now on the Western Front, not alongside the British or Empire forces, but alongside the French in that bitter defence of the ground close to Paris as the Germans pushed through in one of their spring offensives. And in a chapter that he called In the Valley of the Shadow, Allen recounts, "Let me remark that if you are one of those who think everybody is brave under shellfire, you are wrong. Everybody simply shakes and crawls." Allen went on to describe that in this first action, it was essentially an artillery battle. He notes, "Yesterday all was quiet along the front except for intermittent artillery duels. So says the communique we read. Thank God a few of us can know what that really means. Our batteries were throwing over 10 to 1. There would be a half hour of quiet, then whistle, smash, another shell from Jerry. Then our batteries barking like a lots of savage dogs with the howls of our own shells, rockets, falling trees, screams, the flop of gas shells, white-faced men digging like mad or standing up under it according to their temperament, some cool, some shaking, some weeping, a few grim jokes, but mostly just dull endurance, a hunching of the shoulders when another comes, and the thought, how long, how long? There is nothing to do. Whether you get through or not is just sheer chance, and nothing more. You may and you may not. C'est la guerre. We stayed in that place, which the men called Death Valley, for 5 days. So that was Hervey Allen's introduction to warfare on the Western Front, and later he fought again with his unit alongside the French near Chateau Thierry, and the book is a superb account of that battle from an American perspective, both in and out of the line. And that's what I love about some of these memoirs. It's not so much just the trench experience that you get from these books, it's what it's like for these men when they come away from the battlefield and they have to process these experiences. And for me, that's the mark of a very good book about the Great War, that it doesn't just focus on the actual battlefield itself, but it's as their journey brings them nearer and nearer to this town on the Aisne, Fismes, that the book reaches its pinnacle, both in terms of Allen's writing and the power of this story. Allen recounts, "At daybreak to our left we saw the gaunt skeleton of a shelled church with a cluster of ruined houses around it. This was Mont Saint-Martin, according to the map, and in the valley, just over the slope of the hill, lay Fismes. We were almost on the verge of that slope and overlooked quite an amphitheatre of hills behind us. In front there was a field, a stretch of a few hundred yards, and then the ground fell away steeply to the Vela River. From our trench, as far as I could see, the road was lined on both sides with bobbing tin hats. Here are some notes I took at the time, showing exactly how it appeared. An old helmet like a hurt turtle on the parapet is dragging a chin strap tied to a bloody rag, and the eye of a machine gun stares at me from its tripod in perpetual surprise. There are alternate bands of shadow and white sunlight across the trench, and down its long vista I see many men in a row. A fat soldier is sleeping with his back in the air like a pile of clothes. Another is in profile. He's staring across the fields, and the feet of a dead man stick out stiffly over a stretcher. His hands are raised to his gas mask in rigid protest where there is blood. There is a blank air of utter idleness about. It is a lonesome land full of the sense of impending disaster. All that day we lay along the road and heard machine gun fire and trench mortars from Fismes in the valley. There was a constant harassing artillery fire too, from both sides. Our position was under direct observation, and every once in a while Fritz would skip a few shells over the fields at the working parties or grub details that passed constantly up and down the road. Every now and then a man was carried on a stretcher, limp and gassed. They were bringing them up out of the valley all day long. In his next chapter, entitled Into the Pit, Hervey Allen describes how they were sent into Fismes to relieve the men of the 112th Infantry, who were part of their own division. And he describes this crossing of the Vela River on the bridge. I must say that road was terrific. 4 or 5 shells a minute were coming. There was always one in the air. These burst with an earth-rocking smash on the other side of the road, just on the far side of the railway embankment. On the safe side of the road were the prone figures of the men hugging the ground. Branches, stones, iron fragments, and all manner of debris was hurtling about us. Trees were crashing, and over our heads the machine guns were firing in a frenzy of chattering rage. We found the engineers working frantically at the bridge, an old stone approach that they were trying to repair with planks. I questioned the engineer officer in a series of shouts, and he gave us a guide to take us to the dugout of the major of the 112th, whose battalion was occupying the town. We crossed the bridge just on one plank, which was all that was ready, and found ourselves immediately among the houses and on the paved streets of a good-sized town. Behind us was the pandemonium of the barrage and the hammers of the engineers working feverishly at the bridge, all of which echoed up the empty street, mingled with the crackle of roof slates and the tiles and bricks over which we stumbled. Pressing on for about 2 blocks, we turned suddenly into the main street of the town. The fronts of large and handsome houses, built wall to wall, looked blindly across at each other, with rows of open doors and yawning windows as far as the eye could reach. It was a city of the dead, only wakened by the noise of firing, the glare of strange lights, and the flicks of rifle fire here and there. Now, this battle that they were coming into was not the kind of traditional trench warfare on the Western Front that we think of. This was a fluid battle. In most cases, in places like Fismes, there probably weren't any clear trench positions for these men to occupy. They were moving over open ground, open roads, crossing rivers like the Vela, and going into the ruins of a town. So this was urban warfare, really. And the situation in the town of Fismes was very confusing at this time, with both sides sharing parts of it, often sharing parts of the same street, and almost certainly in sections of those streets, parts of the same building, with Germans on one side and Americans on the other. But there was a pocket of AEF troops, of American troops, holding the ground close to the river itself and close to Fismes Town Hall, and forward posts were pushed across the Vela River at Fismes itself, so close to this bridge. Allen found a lot of evidence of the Germans. His dugouts had a German name, Villa Bremen, and the town had once been a German billets before the battle here in that early summer period of 1918. But for him, it was a strange place like no other he'd seen. He wrote, "While the place was so quiet, I felt determined to see the town, partly from curiosity and partly from a desire to know my way about the place in case of future necessity. I left Horner standing on the corner near the town hall and made towards the cone-shaped hill I'd seen from the garret windows of the seminary. Imagine your own home town without a single soul in it, wrecked after a great storm and partly burned, with all the evidence of the familiar activities of everyday life about, but that life and movement cut off suddenly, turned off like a light, and you will have an idea of Fismes. The looted stores stood gaping vacantly around the main square, where I met part of the machine gun battalion. They had their guns set up about halfway down a long hall that commanded a view of the street leading to the bridge. Rocks and earth were piled up as a sort of breastwork on the floor, and the ammunition was in the library. A corporal here warned me about the streets. One corner was bad for snipers. I could see it from the window upstairs, and there was a dead runner lying with the red band on his arm. We dodged across the street to the town hall. This was a lovely white stone Hotel de Ville with a mansard roof. There was a big wooden sign over the door in German, proclaiming it the Zone Kommandatur's headquarters. The inside was badly wrecked. A mess of German and French town records lay all over the place. So this was the kind of war that these American doughboys found themselves fighting. They'd done training about trench warfare, they'd heard instruction from British and French officers and men, and learnt about the battles of the years that had passed before they'd even arrived. But now they were being thrown into what was much more like a modern war, perhaps a war of the next conflict, where they were thrown into towns like this that had been torn apart, like a child had run mad through the streets and destroyed these places, and they were seeing the fragments of other people's lives, and in this case other people's conflict, war, lying around them. And it was a rude awakening for men who had grown up in the United States to see Europe torn apart in this way. And I think for many of them there, it was a landmark in their experiences that would have resonance for them when they returned home, to never want to see this kind of war ever fought again. And for Americans, of course, was this idea that they were fighting a war for democracy, and perhaps even stronger than some of the British soldiers earlier in the war, an idea that they were fighting a war to literally end all wars. So there was a kind of imperative behind what they were doing in battles like this. But these battles were confusing, and confusing for the men to process and understand at the time. But Alan gives us this fantastic account of it in his book, and what we discover through reading that account is that once in position, Alan and his men were now at the front line at Fismes and Fismes, and told they would not be relieved now until the Germans in this area had been pushed back. So this was the tail end of the battle, in this second Battle of the Marne, where the Germans were running out of steam, but they were still pushing hard against key positions, of which this was one. And the Germans didn't disappoint, because they soon counterattacked in this area, and Alan placed his men close to the river, using the railway embankment and any raised position where his Chauchat machine gun teams could lay down automatic fire into the enemy. Now, the Americans, units of the American Expeditionary Force, had automatic weapons, and those, like the 28th Division that fought alongside the French, were equipped largely with French automatic weapons. So they had Hotchkiss machine guns and the Chauchat light machine gun. Now, this is one of the most disparaged machine guns of the First World War. It's a light, and I kind of use that word loosely, a light machine gun, because it's pretty heavy, and it's got a kind of banana-shaped magazine that sits underneath the weapon, and it looks primitive. It looks as if it's kind of been thrown together. When it was chambered to 8mm, which is the French ammunition, it seemed to work quite well and was popular with French soldiers and gave a good account of itself. The weapons that the Americans had been rechambered to 30.06, which is the standard American round used in the American forces in the First World War, and I think there was a few issues with that. But a lot of the bad press, I think, about the Chauchat is unfair, because it was used to good effect as a light support weapon on the ground. It wasn't as good as other weapons, most notably the Lewis gun, and the kind of irony that the Lewis was invented by an American but yet used most numerously by the British and Empire forces on the Western Front. So the Shashat light machine gun used by the French, used by the Americans, you see a lot of French kit, not just machine guns, but artillery as well. The Americans didn't really come with a huge amount of their own weapon systems. They had Springfield rifles, they had Browning automatic rifles, but once they were in an area where they were fighting alongside the French and needed to be equipped with a lot of modern weapons quickly, it was understandable that French kit would be delivered to them because, particularly with artillery, 75mm field guns, there would be a huge amount of munitions that could be readily supplied. So in this respect, the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, was an interesting formation on the Western Front because the bulk of it was fighting alongside the French later on, in particular in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, but part of it was then also sent to the British, and on that part of the front, instead of having French kit, they had British kit. So their men didn't even use Springfield rifles, they used short magazine Lee Enfields, Lewis guns, Vickers guns, they had British tanks, British artillery and so on. So it was a fascinating kind of diverse army, the AEF, equipped with a really broad range of equipment, and I think that element of it has fascinated a lot of people over many, many years. But I would guess that on the ground, adopting weapon systems developed by other nations that were strange to you would have been part of the learning process, but also probably would have caused an element of problems for the men on the ground coming to terms and becoming familiar with these weapons, while often the gap between receiving them and going into combat was very, very short indeed. But this was all part of the learning process of the AEF on the Western Front, and this battle here at Fismes was very much at the centre of that period of learning before it would go into its biggest and deadliest period on the Western Front, which was that Battle of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. But that was yet to happen in Hervey Allen's tale. So with his positions around Fismes and Fismes, close to the bridge, defending that little pocket in the town, using what positions they had as key defensive points, what they found was that the Germans pushed hard against the bridgehead in Fismes, and there was hand-to-hand fighting in those narrow streets and in the houses, and those houses changed hands again and again, with many men, as they tried to manoeuvre between buildings, being hit by sniper fire. The German attack, however, fizzled out with considerable losses, and Allen looked around and wondered what the cost to his own unit had been, for to him Fismes was but a sideshow, really. They were here for the big show, for the big event, but this was a tiny battle in a tiny suburb of a tiny town, and in that respect Allen couldn't see the point in holding onto such a tiny bridgehead indefinitely. What was it all for? But next day orders came to attack, not just to defend, but to attack, an attack which would take them through Fismes to capture the high ground beyond, and they would be fighting alongside the 2nd Battalion of their regiment in this battle. Extra ammunition and grenades were issued to the men, and then it was time to cross the bridge once more and go over the Wähler in strength. Allen wrote, "The Germans were very close. There was a halt for a minute or two at the bridge before we left the shelter of the last house. This in order to see that the column was well closed up. Then we started over, making a tremendous noise, it seemed. At the end of the town there was the flash and crackle of rifle fire. The Germans had been bursting shells on the bridge for several days, and the stone above the arch had in one place been blown through, making an oval dip about the middle of the bridge, with half of the roadway blown away, showing the river underneath. Big stones from the coping lay scattered about on the top of the bridge itself, and in one place only there was a stretch about 2 feet wide on which to cross. The river below was a tangle of debris, a snarl of old wire. The mud banks were splashed and pitted with shell holes, where the mud geysers had spouted over everything when the shells hit. Over this bridge we started, hoping fervently the enemy machine gunners would not see us. About 50 yards up the road on the other side, some of our men in a ruin were fighting the Germans across the street in another house. The firing through windows and from between cracks in the walls lit the night fitfully. The captain crossed first and turned to the left on the other side, followed by the men in file. We went through a gutted house and out into the village street beyond. I stood at the bridge, keeping the men closed up until our last platoon was over, and I saw A Company following. As the captain turned to the left, I heard 2 or 3 rifle cracks, but paid no attention to them at the time. As soon as the company was over, I hastened to catch up with him again. But when I turned the corner into the single lonely street of Fismes, I found 3 or 4 of our lads gathered about the body of one of our own men. It was Charlie Wright, from whose helmet the spent bullet had glanced when we came into Fismes. He had been shot by one of our own men, having for some reason or other stepped out into the street between the houses where the fighting had been going on. He was certainly dead. It seemed tremendously futile. We were in a straight village street, packed solid with houses on either side. The back doors of one line of houses opened out onto a field that stretched on a gentle slope about 200 yards down to the river. From the backyards of the buildings on the other side of the street rose a steep hill. The Germans were up there somewhere. Ahead was a cross street where there was almost constant flash of mortar shells. A whole battery was playing on it from the heights above. There was only one thing to do: occupy all the town that we could and hold it. The 112th man was too impatient to leave to give us much information. I didn't blame him. I wished that it was he relieving us. But just holding Fismes was not an option for the men of the 28th Division, and soon orders came for the attack. Alan wrote, "I motioned forward to the line ahead of me and jumped up with them, leading out into the fields up the hill. The machine guns were like 100 riveters going all at once. Such a chattering I have never heard. Just where we were, there was a little draw in the hill which seems to have saved us. At that part of the line, we advanced about 50 yards, I judged. Looking back, I saw the rest of the line returning. There was absolutely no place to advance to. It was a brave but senseless attack. Some of the men lay down and fired where they were. I think I took about 6 men back with me behind the wall in my section of the line. Most of those who lay out in the fields were killed, but a few crawled back that night." Thrown back, Alan worried that given the losses they'd sustained, how could they even hold the town now? But hold it they did, at least for that moment. A further attack was put in by another company, while Alan and what was left of his men held the town. That attack, over the same slopes, failed too. The loss had been terrific. Some of the companies were down to a few men. The gain had been nothing, and we'd exposed the smallness of our force to the Germans. A German plane came down so close it seemed to glide along the roofs. All was silence in the courts and the houses till it passed. The aviator could have counted our buttons. No one was fool enough to shoot at him. As usual at that time, the Germans owned the air. Captain Thompson had been killed, hit by a shell. Some of his men said while he was shouting to them to rally for the 3rd time. The survivors were all in no shape to stand any further strain, having borne all that flesh and blood could, and more. The town was choked with dead and wounded. Even my own little dugout was full of them by this time. And sensing that they might have some kind of advantage, the Germans once more pushed hard against Alan and his men. He recounts how one of his Shashat machine gunners, Nick de Saza, who had defended the ground around the river, was last seen firing his Shashat to the last, killed instantly by a shell fragment. Night covered their positions, and then the Germans sent over gas, and everyone was in a gas mask. Alan describes the Dante-esque atmosphere in Fismes at this time. Shells dropping, the air thick with poison gas, flashes of gunfire and artillery screeching through the darkness of night, and then one last terrible move by the Germans, almost like a death throw, an attack with flamethrowers. Flamethrowers, those fearful weapons first used against Allied troops in the early years of the war, and in the close confines of trenches, often used with devastating, horrific effect. And now, on the hills and in the streets around Fismes, they were being used once more. Just before he himself was wounded, Alan recalled the final moments above the Vela River. I stood trying to get the men out of the dugout, half wondering what I was trying to do at times, and then remembering. It was strangely quiet. Someone came and said, "They're all dead up there along the wall, Lieutenant, and there's no one between us and C Company. The machine gun is knocked out." I tried to think this one out. Suddenly, along the top of the hill, there was a puff, a rolling cloud of smoke, and then a great burst of dirty, yellow flame. By its glare, I could see Gerald standing halfway up the hill with his pistol drawn. It was the Flammenwerfer, the flamethrowers, the men along the crest, curled up like leaves to save themselves as the flame and smoke rolled clear over them. There was another flash between the houses. One of the men stood up, turning around, outlined against the flame. "Oh my God!" he cried. "Oh God!" And it's at that moment, that critical moment, ending with that terrible cry of a soldier as flame leapt down the street towards him, that's where Alan's book comes to a conclusion. Alan's narrative, woven in that mix of memoir and fiction, so common with soldiers who tried to explain, write about their war. They couldn't always write a memoir, but fictionalizing their memoir was a way of coping with it, I guess. And what this book does, it gives this tiny little battle in the history of the American Expeditionary Force this nightmarish air, and puts a pin in it and marks it for all time. Alan's book is an affecting account of men at the sharp end of war and deserves to be much, much better known. For the 111th Infantry and the men of the Iron Division, this was their first major action, but not their last. They went on to fight in the mighty Meuse-Argonne offensive and witness the $1 million barrage. But first actions, first experience of real combat have a way of haunting a unit and the men who served in it, and Fismes and Fismes certainly haunted them. I've often said in this podcast that there is a link between old comrades organisations and the writing of a unit history and the building of a memorial, and this is true in the case of the 28th Division. That unit being a National Guard unit, men drawn from Pennsylvania, they went back home, the survivors like Hervey Allen, and they kept in touch with each other. They had meetups. That secret life that they'd had in France during the Great War could only properly be explained to each other. That was the importance of these old comrades groupings, and through that they published histories of the unit and a desire built to memorialise it. And for those survivors of the 28th Division, Fismes was the place their memorial had to go. And it was funded by the state of Pennsylvania to create a practical memorial. That bridge that had been at the very heart of their battle here in 1918 had been destroyed, and the good people of Fismes and Fismes who returned after the Great War needed a new bridge to connect their communities once more, and all that American blood that had been spilled in the streets and the hills and across that river, it had to mean something. And here it would mean the creation of a bridge, bridging not only those two French communities, but bridging the Atlantic from the United States across to France, a hand of friendship and a hand of remembrance for what that war had meant. And unveiled in 1928, this was a practical memorial, but with plenty of features to show what it stood for. Those women standing on the columns by the main stanchions of the bridge, and the carved faces. They are incredible bits of sculpture, simple, small carved faces of American doughboys in the broad-brimmed helmets that they wore on the battlefield, looking out across that landscape which had cost so much of their blood in 1918. Within a dozen years, Europe was at war once more. And that generation of men like Alan, who had served in the trenches of the Western Front with the American Expeditionary Force, how would they have felt about that? That's something I feel that there simply has not been enough research on in terms of the experience of American troops. I read an account of men from one part of America who had kind of kept quiet about their experiences later in life because they had fought that war for democracy, that war to end all wars, and a generation later another war had followed, and they felt that they'd somehow failed, and they kept quiet. Perhaps a reason why that generation is not as well known as other generations that have gone to war for America. But in that gap of a dozen years, as Europe was thrown into conflict once more, as we've described at the very beginning of this podcast, the bridge at Fismes was destroyed in May 1940. It was seemingly rebuilt during the German occupation period, even if it was a temporary bridge, and doesn't appear to have been destroyed in September 1944, when, incredibly, it was American troops, having broken out from the liberation of Paris and gone east from Paris. They came through the Aisne Valley, and they were the ones who liberated Fismes in September 1944, 80 years ago this month. And when I went in March, the area around the bridge now is also a memorial park, that centenary project to commemorate the events here of 1918, with information and photographs and these carved wooden figures of soldiers by the side of the river. And there it is, giving not just the history of what happened there, but Hervey Allen and his incredible book gets a mention here too. And when I went in March, bounced me back down to earth again on the old front line, and made me think about this book, this story, and this place. Just down the road is the Was Aisne American Cemetery. An American cemetery had once existed here in Fismes, and I've got a postcard image of it which I'll put onto the podcast website. But as was common practice on these American battlefields of the Great War, the dead, while buried in situ during the conflict, was then moved to concentration cemeteries prior to the families deciding whether those lads should go home or remain forevermore. And in this cemetery, there's over 6,000 burials, many of them from the 28th Division, from that fighting around Fismes and Fismes in August of 1918. And there are others listed amongst the missing on the walls of the chapel. In all of these American cemeteries, as we've described in previous episodes covering American cemeteries of the Great War, there is a chapel of remembrance recalling those who do not have a known grave. Both burials and names on the wall include men who Allen mentions in his book, including that young machine gunner, de Caesar, who was last seen firing his Shashat machine gun from the hip until he was hit by a shell blast. He's listed on the memorial to the missing, and there's quite a few 28th Division men from that battle on there. Was it the artillery fire? Was it the nature of the ground that caused so many not to be found or identified? Or was it the dreadful nature of the finale to that battle as flamethrowers hit those fields and weaved its terrible death down the lanes and the streets of Fismes. The fact that he and so many others do not have a known grave is a testimony to the terrible nature of the fighting in those two small communities around the Vela River in 1918. Although Alan never said it as such in Towards the Flame, for him and so many in the Iron Division, this place, this insignificant little corner of eastern France, would stand out for them above all others. For American soldiers, just like those from Britain and its wider empire who fought those great battles to the north, here in the Ain Valley, this place would be their corner, their criss-cross paths of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.